Section 1. She married him to save her father, believing it was just a cold business deal, but what neither of them expected was that he would fall for her, and when betrayal strikes, will love be enough to keep them together? The hospital room was eerily silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, clinging to Emma Carter's skin like an invisible weight. She sat beside her father's hospital bed, her fingers tightly clutching his frail, wrinkled hand. His breaths were shallow, each inhale and exhale a battle against his own body's weakness. Emma had spent the past 2 months living in this hospital, watching her father deteriorate day by day. The once strong man who had worked tirelessly to provide for her now looked fragile, his once tanned skin pale under the fluorescent lights. She could barely recognize him anymore. The doctors had made it clear, without surgery, he wouldn't have long. But the surgery was expensive, too expensive. Emma had tried everything. She had drained her savings, sold her car, maxed out every credit card she had. But the hospital bills kept piling up, a mountain of debt that no amount of hope could climb. She had applied for every loan imaginable, only to be turned away because she had no collateral, no job that paid enough, no way to prove she could pay it back. The last option had been crowdfunding, but the response had been disheartening. People were sympathetic, but sympathy didn't pay medical bills. She wiped at her eyes, exhaustion pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. She couldn't cry, not now. She had to stay strong for her father, had to believe there was still a way out. Her phone vibrated against the small table beside her. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Her brows furrowed, but she answered anyway. "Hello?" A deep, measured voice responded, smooth yet unreadable. "Emma Carter?" "Yes, who's this?" There was a pause, then the voice said, "Elias Blackwood." Emma's stomach twisted. Elias Blackwood was a name she had never expected to hear. He wasn't just any billionaire. He was the billionaire. The cold-hearted, ruthless CEO of Blackwood Industries. The man whose name carried power and fear in equal measure. Her grip tightened around the phone. "Why are you calling me?" Another pause. "I have a proposal for you." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had heard of Elias Blackwood before, but never in a context that involved her. He was the type of man who didn't associate with ordinary people. His name was spoken in business circles like a legend, a man who built an empire with ice in his veins. She should have hung up, she should have ignored the call, but she didn't. Instead, she whispered, "What kind of proposal?" "I need a wife." Emma nearly dropped the phone. "Excuse me?" "It's simple," Elias said, his voice calm as if he were discussing a business merger. "I need a wife for 1 year. In exchange, I will cover all of your father's medical expenses." Emma's heart pounded. This had to be some kind of joke. She barely knew him. Why would he need a wife? He was one of the most eligible bachelors in the country. Women lined up just for a chance to be in his presence. She let out a shaky laugh. "I don't understand. Why would someone like you need a contract marriage?" Silence stretched between them before he finally responded. "That's not something you need to worry about." Of course, a man like Elias Blackwood wouldn't spill his secret so easily. Emma's fingers dug into her palm. This was insane. Completely insane. She wasn't the kind of person who made reckless decisions. But what choice did she have? She had exhausted every possible option. Her father was running out of time and she had no way to save him. Still, the thought of marrying a man she barely knew, a man as ruthless as Elias Blackwood, sent a shiver down her spine. Her voice faltered. "I'll give you a day to think about it," Elias said. His tone was controlled, patient, but there was an edge to it, as if he knew she would say yes. The call ended before she could say another word. Emma sat there, staring at her phone, her mind spinning. This was crazy, and yet for the first time in weeks she felt something close to hope. The next morning, Emma sat across from Elias Blackwood in a sleek, glass-walled office at Blackwood Tower. Everything about him screamed power, from his custom-tailored suit to the way he sat with effortless confidence, like a king surveying his kingdom. His eyes, an icy shade of gray, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "Have you made your decision?" he asked. Emma swallowed. She had spent the entire night weighing the pros and cons, but in the end there was no real choice. Her father's life depended on it. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll do it." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Elias's expression before he reached into his desk drawer, and pulled out a document. He slid it across the table toward her. A contract. "Read through it," he said. "If you agree, sign at the bottom." Emma's hands trembled as she picked up the contract. The terms were simple yet chilling in their clarity. 1 year, no emotional involvement, no expectations beyond public appearances. The moment she signed, she would become Mrs. Elias Blackwood, not because of love, but because of necessity. She took a deep breath. Then, with a final glance at Elias, she signed her name. The moment the ink dried, Elias reached for the contract and tucked it away. His expression remained unreadable as he stood, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. "Our wedding will be in 3 days," he said, as if he had just closed another business deal. Emma's heart pounded. 3 days. 3 days until her life changed forever. She had just married herself to a man known for his lack of empathy, a man who saw relationships as transactions. But what she didn't know was that Elias Blackwood never made a deal without expecting something in return. Section 2. The weight of her decision pressed down on Emma like a heavy fog as she walked out of Blackwood Tower. The world outside bustled as usual. Cars zipped through the streets. People hurried along the sidewalks. Coffee shops were filled with laughter and conversation. But for her, everything had changed. 3 days. In 3 days, she would become Mrs. Elias Blackwood. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, not out of excitement, not out of nervous anticipation, but out of sheer disbelief that her life had taken such a drastic turn. She tightened her coat around herself, feeling the cold city air bite at her skin. The hospital was her next stop. If she was going to go through with this, she needed to see her father, needed to remind herself why she had made this impossible choice. As she entered the hospital room, the familiar beeping of machines and the scent of antiseptic filled her senses. Her father lay in bed, his eyes closed, his breathing steady but weak. His skin was pale, almost translucent, as if life itself was slowly slipping away from him. "Hey, Dad," she whispered, forcing a smile as she sat beside him. His eyelids fluttered open, and for a brief moment, the weariness in his face was replaced by warmth. "Emma," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "You look tired, sweetheart. You need to rest." Emma swallowed hard, if only he knew. "I'm fine," she lied. "I have good news." His tired eyes sparked with curiosity. "Oh?" She hesitated, unsure of how to phrase what she was about to say. "How did you tell your dying father that you were marrying a billionaire to save his life? How did you explain that love had nothing to do with it?" Instead, she settled on, "The hospital bills will be taken care of." His brows furrowed. "Emma, how?" She squeezed his hand, blinking back the sting of tears. "You don't need to worry about that. Just focus on getting better, okay?" Her father studied her, his gaze filled with concern. He had always been able to read her like a book, and she knew he sensed something was wrong, but he was too weak to press her on it. Instead, he simply nodded. "I trust you." Those 3 words nearly broke her. If only he knew the price she had paid for that trust. 3 days passed in a blur. Emma barely had time to process what was happening before she found herself in a grand boutique, standing in front of a mirror, a silk wedding gown clinging to her frame. The stylist flitted around her like a hummingbird, adjusting the gown's delicate lace sleeves, smoothing the fabric, making final alterations. Emma barely recognized the woman in the reflection. Gone was the struggling daughter, weighed down by medical bills and sleepless nights. In her place stood a bride, one who was about to marry the most powerful man in the city. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "I'll send a car for you at noon. Elias." A shiver ran down her spine. This was real. This was happening. No turning back now. The wedding was nothing like the fairy tale ceremonies she had once dreamed of as a little girl. No flowers, no guests, no romance. Just a cold, calculated event orchestrated for efficiency. The courthouse was quiet, almost eerily so, as she walked into the private room where Elias was waiting. He stood by the window, dressed in a sharp black suit, his presence as commanding as ever. The light from the outside world barely softened the harsh lines of his face. His gaze flicked to her, but there was no admiration, no appreciation, just quiet observation, as if assessing a deal before signing the contract. "Are you ready?" he asked. Emma swallowed. "Yes." The officiant began speaking, reading off the vows with practiced detachment. There were no personal promises, no exchanged glances of devotion, just a business agreement spoken in legal terms. When it was time for them to exchange rings, Elias reached into his pocket and produced a sleek platinum band. He slid it onto her finger with the same precision he used in the boardroom. No hesitation, no emotion, and when the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, Elias merely nodded, as if confirming a deal had been closed. There was no kiss, no celebration, just silence. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the man she had just married. What have I done? The drive to Elias's penthouse was just as cold as the ceremony. Emma sat in the back seat of his sleek black car, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring out at the city lights. Elias sat beside her, silent, his attention fixed on his phone as if their wedding had been just another task on his schedule. It made her stomach twist. "You don't talk much, do you?" she finally said, her voice laced with unease. Elias didn't even glance at her. Talking isn't necessary when things are clear. Her jaw tightened. And what exactly is clear? That we both got what we wanted. She let out a humorless laugh. Right, of course. Silence stretched between them once again, suffocating and heavy. It wasn't until they arrived at the penthouse that Elias finally acknowledged her again. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a space that was both breathtaking and intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the glittering city skyline, while sleek black marble floors gleamed under the warm glow of chandeliers. This was his world, and now, for the next year, it was her world too. Elias turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You'll stay here. Your things have already been moved." Emma stiffened. "I didn't agree to—" "This is part of the arrangement," he interrupted, his tone firm. "I need a wife who actually lives with me." A lump formed in her throat. "And what if I say no?" Elias tilted his head, his gray eyes locking onto hers with quiet intensity. "You won't." Emma swallowed hard, because he was right. She had nowhere else to go, no choice but to play the role of Mrs. Elias Blackwood, even if it meant giving up every last piece of herself in the process. Section 3. Emma sat on the edge of the massive king-sized bed, staring at the glittering skyline outside the penthouse window. The city stretched beneath her, a sea of lights and movement, yet she felt utterly trapped. The luxurious surroundings did nothing to comfort her. If anything, they made her feel even more like a caged bird. She was married now, to a billionaire she barely knew, a man who had made it abundantly clear that this wasn't about love. Elias had disappeared into his study the moment they arrived, barely acknowledging her presence, and now she was alone in this cold, unfamiliar space, trying to process the weight of her decision. She absent-mindedly twirled the platinum wedding band on her finger. It felt heavy, foreign. Everything about this was wrong. A knock at the door snapped her out of her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. A middle-aged woman with sharp, knowing eyes stepped inside. She was dressed in a pristine black uniform, her posture rigid. "Good evening, Mrs. Blackwood. I'm Margaret, the house manager. Mr. Blackwood has asked me to ensure you're comfortable." Emma flinched at the name, Mrs. Blackwood. It still didn't feel real. Thank you," she said hesitantly. "I don't really need anything right now." Margaret nodded but didn't leave. Instead, she gave Emma a long, scrutinizing look, as if assessing her. "If I may offer a piece of advice, Mrs. Blackwood," she said carefully. "Mr. Blackwood is a man of routine. He doesn't like surprises." Emma frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Margaret hesitated. "Just that he values order, structure. If you want to make this arrangement easier for yourself, it's best to adapt." Emma's stomach twisted. Adapt. She wasn't sure she even knew how to do that anymore. Before she could respond, Margaret straightened. "Dinner will be served in an hour. Mr. Blackwood expects you to join him." With that, she turned and left, leaving Emma with even more questions than before. Emma sat stiffly at the long dining table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The dining room was as extravagant as the rest of the penthouse. High ceilings, a glittering chandelier, walls adorned with minimalist yet absurdly expensive artwork. The table itself was set impeccably, silverware gleaming under the soft lighting. Elias sat at the opposite end, dressed in his usual crisp suit, the top buttons of his shirt undone. He exuded effortless power, his posture relaxed, yet commanding. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Emma focused on the plate in front of her, the perfectly arranged meal looking more like a piece of art than something edible. "You're quiet," Elias finally said, breaking the silence. She lifted her gaze to meet his. "So are you." His lips twitched, almost as if he were amused. "I'm always quiet." Emma let out a dry laugh. "I've noticed." Silence fell between them again, thick and suffocating. She wanted to ask him a million things: why he had agreed to this, what he expected from her, whether he regretted it, but she wasn't sure she was ready for the answers. Instead, she settled for something safer. "Why did you want a marriage like this?" Elias didn't react right away. He set his fork down, his expression unreadable. "Because it's efficient," he said simply. "No unnecessary emotions, no complications." Emma stared at him. "You really believe that?" His gaze locked onto hers. "I wouldn't have done it if I didn't." Her chest tightened. Of course. Elias Blackwood was a man who never acted on impulse. Every decision was calculated, every move carefully planned. And she was just another part of that plan. She exhaled slowly, pushing her food around her plate. "What about love?" she asked quietly. Elias's jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained cold. "Love is an illusion." Emma swallowed. "You don't believe in it?" "No." His answer was immediate, firm, final. Something inside her cracked. She had known this marriage wasn't about love, but hearing him say it out loud, so unapologetically, so matter-of-factly, made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. For a moment, she imagined a different version of this dinner, one where they were a real couple, where he looked at her not as a business transaction but as someone he cared about. But that was a foolish dream, one she couldn't afford to have. She nodded stiffly, forcing a neutral expression. "Good to know." Elias studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. Then, just as quickly, he looked away. "Finish your food," he said smoothly. "You'll need your strength." Emma blinked. "For what?" He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp. "We have an event tomorrow. You'll need to act the part of my wife." Her stomach twisted. Right, because that's what she was now, his wife. At least while for the next year. Section 4. Emma stood in front of the mirror, staring at the woman reflected back at her. The deep emerald dress hugged her frame elegantly, the fabric smooth and luxurious. It was the kind of dress she would have never been able to afford in her previous life, a life where she worried about medical bills and worked double shifts at the cafe just to make ends meet. But tonight she was Mrs. Blackwood, Elias's wife, at least in the eyes of the world. A soft knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. She turned to see Margaret standing there, her usual composed expression slightly softer than before. "Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you downstairs," Margaret informed her. Emma nodded, exhaling sharply. "Right." She grabbed her clutch and followed Margaret through the hallway of the penthouse, her heels clicking against the marble floor. When she reached the grand staircase, Elias was already there, standing near the entrance with his hands in his pockets. He was dressed in a classic black tuxedo, effortlessly refined, his sharp features illuminated by the golden glow of the chandelier. He looked up as she descended the stairs, his piercing gaze locked onto her. For a brief second, something flickered in his expression, something she couldn't quite place. "Stunning," he murmured as she reached the last step. Emma hesitated, caught off guard by the unexpected compliment. "Thank you." Elias extended his arm, and after a small pause, she placed her hand on his. His grip was firm, warm, but impersonal. "This is a high-profile event," he reminded her as they walked toward the waiting car outside. "Everyone there will be watching us." Emma already knew that. "Which means we need to act like a couple," she said before he could continue. A corner of his lips twitched. "I see you understand." Emma rolled her eyes. "You don't have to keep reminding me. I agreed to this, didn't I?" Elias didn't respond, but the slight smirk remained as he opened the car door for her. The gala was held at one of the most prestigious venues in the city, a sprawling, glass-walled estate overlooking the river. The moment they stepped inside, all eyes turned toward them. Emma stiffened instinctively, but Elias didn't falter. He kept his expression unreadable, his grip on her waist steady as he guided her through the room. The atmosphere was buzzing with conversation, glasses clinking as elegantly dressed guests mingled. Everywhere she looked, there were powerful men and women, business moguls, politicians, elite socialites. This was Elias's world, and for the next year, it had to be hers too. "Elias," a deep voice interrupted their approach. Emma turned to see an older man in his late 50s approaching them, a warm smile on his face. "Robert," Elias greeted, shaking the man's hand. Emma recognized the name immediately. Robert Sinclair, CEO of Sinclair Industries, one of the biggest investors in Blackwood Enterprises. "And this must be the new Mrs. Blackwood," Robert said, turning to her with a charming smile. Emma forced a polite smile. "Emma Blackwood, it's nice to meet you." Robert studied her for a moment before chuckling. "She's much lovelier than I imagined, and here I thought Elias had no interest in romance." Emma stiffened slightly, but Elias remained unfazed. "You know me, Robert," Elias said smoothly. "I don't do anything unless it benefits me." The words stung more than they should have. Emma knew their marriage wasn't real, but hearing him say it so bluntly in front of someone else still made her stomach twist uncomfortably. Robert let out a hearty laugh. Ah, ever the businessman. The conversation shifted to business, and Emma let her mind drift. She was starting to understand what Margaret had meant when she said Elias valued order and structure. Everything about him, his words, his actions, even the way he presented their relationship, was calculated. To him, she was nothing more than another piece of his carefully crafted image. But what about her? How was she supposed to survive in a world where everything felt like a transaction? Hours later, Emma finally had a moment to herself. She stepped onto the balcony, inhaling the crisp night air, letting it cool the heat rising in her chest. This wasn't what she wanted. She had agreed to this marriage to save her father, but she hadn't considered how suffocating it would feel to be in Elias's world, to be paraded around like an accessory, to hear him talk about their marriage as if it were nothing more than a convenient deal. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the city skyline. "You disappeared." Elias's voice was smooth as he stepped onto the balcony, his presence as commanding as ever. Emma didn't turn around. "I needed some air." For a moment there was silence. Then Elias moved beside her, resting his hands on the balcony railing. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said after a pause. Emma scoffed, finally looking at him. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" Elias's lips twitched. "It's an observation." She sighed, shaking her head. "I don't belong here." "You do now." His response was so immediate, so certain, that it startled her. She frowned. "Why do you say that like it's a fact?" Elias turned to her then, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. "Because it is." Emma felt her breath hitch. There was something in his gaze, something intense, unreadable. Before she could respond, Elias reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Emma stiffened at the unexpected gesture, her heart pounding. "Get some rest," he murmured, his fingers lingering just a second longer than necessary before he stepped away. Then, just like that, he was gone. Emma let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her chest. She had agreed to a loveless marriage, so why did it feel like something was shifting between them? Section 5. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them that night at the gala. Elias had always been cold, distant, and utterly controlled, but for the first time, she had seen something else in his gaze, something that didn't fit the rigid, unfeeling persona he had built around himself. She tried to push it out of her mind as she got ready for bed, but as she lay under the soft sheets, staring at the ceiling of the grand bedroom she had been given in Elias's penthouse, her thoughts kept circling back to him. She hadn't expected kindness from him. She hadn't expected warmth. And maybe that moment on the balcony was nothing. Maybe it was just another calculated move, another way to ensure that she continued to play the role of his devoted wife. But it hadn't felt like nothing. The next morning, she was determined to move forward. Their deal was simple. She would stay married to Elias for a year, and he would pay for her father's medical bills. That was all. There was no reason to dwell on his rare moment of softness, but Elias made it difficult to ignore. She expected him to retreat back into his usual indifference, but he didn't. Instead, he started noticing things. When she came downstairs for breakfast, he was already at the table, sipping his coffee while reading over a stack of business reports. "You didn't sleep well," he commented without looking up. Emma blinked. "What?" "You have dark circles under your eyes," he said simply, turning a page. "That means you either slept poorly or not at all." She frowned, caught off guard by the observation. "That's really none of your concern." Elias finally looked up, his blue eyes sharp but unreadable. "You're my wife." Emma let out a small, humorless laugh. "In name only." He set his coffee down and leaned back in his chair. You agreed to this arrangement, Emma. That means you need to take care of yourself. She narrowed her eyes. Are you seriously telling me to take care of myself while you're the one who works 18-hour days and barely sleeps? A ghost of a smirk flickered across his lips. I function just fine. That's not the point. Elias studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the plate of food in front of her. Eat. Emma sighed but picked up her fork. She knew arguing with him was pointless, and truthfully she was too exhausted to fight over something as simple as breakfast. As they ate in silence, she realized how strangely domestic this moment was. She had been living in Elias's penthouse for a few weeks now, but this was the first time they had actually shared a meal together. It felt normal, and that scared her. She had spent years building walls around herself, protecting her heart from the kind of pain she had suffered before. Falling for Elias Blackwood would be a disaster, she knew that. But what if he was falling for her first? Later that day, Emma found herself walking through the halls of Blackwood Enterprises. She had never been to Elias's office before, but Margaret had called her, saying Elias wanted her to meet him there. She wasn't sure what to expect, but as she stepped into the sleek, glass-walled office, she immediately felt out of place. Elias sat behind a massive black desk, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair. He was in the middle of a conversation with a group of executives, his voice sharp and authoritative. When he saw her, he gave her a single nod before dismissing the meeting. The executives filed out, throwing curious glances at Emma as they passed. Once they were alone, Elias gestured for her to sit. I wasn't expecting to be summoned, Emma said as she took a seat across from him. Elias leaned back in his chair, studying her with that same unreadable gaze. I wanted to discuss something with you. Emma raised an eyebrow. Business or personal? His lips twitched. A bit of both. She crossed her arms. Okay, I'm listening. Elias exhaled, drumming his fingers on the desk. There's an investors' dinner coming up next week. I need you to attend with me. Emma frowned. Why? We're married, Emma, he reminded her. And people are watching. It's important that we continue to present a united front. She hesitated. She had barely gotten through the last event without losing her composure. Is this really necessary? She asked. Elias's gaze darkened. Everything I do is necessary. She sighed. Fine, but I'm not spending the entire night pretending to be the perfect doting wife. I'll go, but I'm not going to be your accessory. Elias tilted his head slightly, as if amused by her defiance. Understood. There was a brief silence before he spoke again. I also wanted to discuss your father. Emma stiffened. What about him? Elias reached for a folder on his desk and slid it toward her. I had his medical records reviewed by one of the best specialists in the country. Emma's breath caught as she opened the folder. I didn't ask you to do that, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. You didn't have to, Elias said simply. I told you I keep my promises. Emma swallowed hard. She had spent so long fighting to protect her father, to make sure he had the best care possible. But she had never expected Elias to do this, to go above and beyond the terms of their arrangement. She looked up at him, searching for some kind of ulterior motive. But for once, she found none. Thank you, she said softly. Elias held her gaze. Don't thank me yet. Her stomach twisted with something she couldn't quite name. This was dangerous. Whatever was happening between them was far beyond what they had agreed upon. She needed to remember why she was here. Because if she forgot, if she let herself believe that Elias Blackwood was anything other than a ruthless businessman, she would be the one to get hurt in the end. Section 6. Emma spent the rest of the day trying to process what had just happened in Elias's office. The investors' dinner was one thing. She had expected more of these public appearances, but the fact that he had gone out of his way to have a specialist review her father's case was something she never saw coming. Elias Blackwood was a businessman. Everything he did was calculated, precise, and beneficial to him in some way. He never made a move without a reason. So why did this feel different? She told herself not to overthink it. He was just ensuring their contract went smoothly. That was all. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the whole truth. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling in her darkened bedroom. The city lights outside flickered through the massive windows, casting shadows across the room. She could hear Elias moving around in his own room down the hall. The penthouse was massive, but at times like this, it felt suffocatingly small. Emma turned on her side, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. She had spent the past few weeks trying to keep her distance from Elias, reminding herself that this was temporary, that no matter how much he surprised her, he wasn't hers. But each day it was getting harder to believe that. The next morning, Emma decided to visit her father at the hospital. She arrived early, bringing his favorite tea from the cafe down the street. Her father, William Carter, was sitting up in bed, reading a book when she entered. Emma. He greeted her warmly, setting the book aside. What a nice surprise. She smiled, placing the cup on his bedside table. I thought you could use something warm to drink. He chuckled. You always know what I need. Emma sat down beside him, hesitating before speaking. Dad, I need to ask you something. His expression turned curious. Of course, sweetheart, what is it? She took a deep breath. Elias hired a specialist to review your case. Her father blinked, clearly surprised. He did? She nodded. He didn't tell me until yesterday. I had no idea he was even looking into it. Her father studied her for a moment before speaking. And how do you feel about that? Emma hesitated. I don't know. I should be grateful, and I am. But I also don't understand why he would do it. William smiled gently. Maybe he cares about you more than you think. Emma let out a small laugh. That's impossible. Her father shook his head. Emma, I may be old, but I'm not blind. I see the way you talk about him, the way you try not to care but do anyway. Emma swallowed hard. Dad, this isn't a real marriage. It's a contract. William gave her a knowing look. And yet he's going out of his way to help you. Contracts don't usually come with that kind of generosity. Emma looked down at her hands. Was that what this was? Generosity? Or was Elias feeling something he wasn't willing to admit? She pushed the thought away. It didn't matter, because no matter what Elias felt, this arrangement had an expiration date, and she couldn't afford to forget that. Later that afternoon, Emma returned to the penthouse. She expected Elias to be out, as he usually was, but to her surprise, he was home. He was standing in the living room, his sleeves rolled up, holding a glass of whiskey. She hesitated before walking over. You're home early. Elias glanced at her. Meetings ended sooner than expected. Emma nodded awkwardly, shifting on her feet. Listen, I went to see my dad today. Elias raised an eyebrow. And, she exhaled, I told him about the specialist. He said nothing, simply waiting for her to continue. He was surprised, she admitted. And so am I. Elias took a slow sip of his drink. Why? Emma let out a humorless laugh. Because this isn't part of our deal. Elias set his glass down on the table and turned to face her fully. Does everything have to be part of a deal, Emma? She blinked at him, taken aback. He took a step closer. I told you before, I keep my promises. You needed help, so I helped. Emma shook her head. It's not that simple. Elias smirked. You like to make things complicated. She crossed her arms. And you don't? His gaze darkened. I don't waste time questioning things that don't need questioning. Emma huffed. Of course you don't. Elias studied her for a moment before sighing. You always assume there's an ulterior motive. Has it ever occurred to you that maybe I just wanted to do something for you? Emma's breath hitched. No, that hadn't occurred to her, because men like Elias Blackwood didn't do things out of the goodness of their hearts, did they? She swallowed hard. I don't know what you want from me. Elias's jaw clenched. I don't know either. For the first time, he looked almost frustrated, as if he was grappling with something he didn't fully understand. The air between them grew thick with tension. Then, as if catching himself, Elias took a step back. Get some rest. The investors' dinner is tomorrow. And just like that, the moment was gone. Emma nodded stiffly before retreating to her room. She pressed a hand to her chest, her heart racing. What was happening between them? And more importantly, could she survive it? The next evening, Emma stood in front of the full-length mirror in her room, adjusting the elegant gown she had been given for the dinner. The deep navy dress hugged her figure perfectly, the silky material cascading down to the floor. She barely recognized herself. A knock at the door made her jump. Come in, she called. The door opened and Elias stepped inside. His gaze flickered over her, and for a brief moment, she swore she saw something raw in his expression, but it was gone just as quickly. You look acceptable, he said smoothly. Emma rolled her eyes. Don't get too sentimental on me. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Come on, the car is waiting. Emma followed him out, her heart pounding the entire way. She had survived the first event, but something told her this one would be different, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Section 7. The investors' dinner was held at one of the most exclusive 5-star hotels in the city, a place where power, money, and influence gathered under crystal chandeliers, where deals worth billions were discussed over wine, and where everyone present knew they had something to gain, or something to lose. Emma stepped out of the car, feeling a wave of nerves she tried to suppress. She had been to one of these events before, but tonight felt different. She wasn't just Elias Blackwood's wife. She was the woman he had gone out of his way to protect, and people would notice. Elias stepped out beside her, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. His mere presence commanded attention. Even without trying, he was the most powerful man in the room. He turned to her, his voice low. "Stay close to me tonight." Emma frowned. "I'm not going anywhere." His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond. Instead, he extended his hand toward her. She hesitated before taking it, feeling a strange warmth spread through her when his fingers curled around hers. They entered the ballroom together. The moment they stepped inside, heads turned. Conversations shifted. People whispered behind glasses of expensive champagne. Emma had been here before, surrounded by the city's wealthiest elites, but now she was one of them. She hated the way they looked at her, like she was a piece of property Elias had acquired, something to be assessed and discussed. Elias, on the other hand, ignored them all. His attention was fixed on their path forward. A man in his 50s approached them, smiling broadly. "Elias Blackwood," he greeted. "It's been too long." Elias's grip on Emma's hand tightened slightly before he let go. "James Montgomery," he said smoothly, shaking the man's hand. Montgomery turned his gaze to Emma, eyes scanning her carefully. "And this must be the wife we've all been hearing about." Emma forced a polite smile. "Emma Blackwood, it's a pleasure." Montgomery chuckled, his gaze lingering on her just a little too long. "I must admit, Elias, you continue to surprise me." Elias's expression remained unreadable. "How so?" Montgomery took a sip of his champagne, smirking. "You've never been one for sentimental attachments. And yet, here you are." Emma felt Elias stiffen beside her. Before he could respond, another voice cut in. "Elias, I thought you said you weren't the marrying type." A stunning woman in a red dress approached them, her dark eyes glinting with amusement. Emma immediately recognized her. Victoria Lane, a high-powered businesswoman, ruthless in negotiations, and a woman Elias had once been linked to. She was tall, poised, and exuded an air of authority that matched Elias's own. Emma suddenly felt out of place. Victoria's gaze shifted to her. "And you must be Emma," she said, her lips curving into a polite smile. "I've heard quite a bit about you." Emma lifted her chin slightly. "Hopefully all good things." Victoria let out a soft laugh, sipping her wine. "Of course. Elias is a difficult man to pin down. I imagine it must have taken some effort." Emma's smile remained, but something about Victoria's tone made her stomach twist. Was she implying what Emma thought she was? That she had somehow tricked Elias into this marriage? Elias, who had remained quiet up until now, finally spoke. "Emma and I don't owe anyone an explanation." His voice was sharp, his blue eyes cold. Victoria's expression didn't waver, but the air around them grew heavier. After a tense pause, she smiled again. "Of course not." Then, with a knowing look, she walked away. Emma exhaled softly, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. Elias turned to her. "Are you all right?" She nodded, even though she wasn't sure. "I'm fine." But as the evening continued, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. Later that night, Emma found herself standing alone by the balcony, needing a moment to breathe. The city lights stretched out before her, twinkling like stars. She had handled herself well tonight. She had smiled, spoken politely, and kept her composure. But inside, she was exhausted. Elias had left to handle some business discussions, and she had told him she would be fine on her own. But as she stood there, staring into the night, a familiar voice made her freeze. "You don't belong here." Emma turned slowly, her heart dropping. "Victoria." The woman stepped onto the balcony, her expression unreadable. Emma squared her shoulders. "Excuse me." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "You heard me." Emma clenched her fists. "I don't know what you think you know about me, but—" "I know everything about Elias," Victoria interrupted, stepping closer. "I know how he operates. I know what he values. and I know he doesn't do things without a reason. Emma narrowed her eyes. And what exactly are you implying? Victoria's lips curved into a slow smirk. That this is just another one of his deals. Emma felt her blood run cold. Victoria continued, her voice smooth as silk. I've seen Elias negotiate contracts before. I've seen the way he calculates risk, how he ensures every investment benefits him. This marriage? It's just another one of his carefully crafted agreements. Emma knew Victoria was trying to get under her skin. But the worst part? A small part of her wondered if she was right. She lifted her chin. You don't know anything about my marriage. Victoria arched an eyebrow. Don't I? Emma's jaw tightened. If you're so sure about Elias, then why are you here, trying to convince me? For the first time, Victoria hesitated. Emma stepped forward. If you know Elias so well, then you should know he wouldn't marry someone for no reason. Victoria let out a soft chuckle. Exactly my point. Emma's heart pounded. Victoria leaned in slightly. I'm just giving you a fair warning, she murmured. Elias Blackwood doesn't fall in love. He owns things, and right now, that includes you. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Emma standing there, frozen. By the time Elias found her, she had managed to compose herself. He frowned as he approached. Are you all right? Emma forced a smile. I'm fine. Elias studied her for a moment as if trying to read her expression. She turned away before he could see the doubt in her eyes, because tonight, for the first time, she wasn't sure what was real anymore. Section 8. The ride home from the investors' dinner was cloaked in silence. The tension between them sat thick in the air, pressing against Emma's chest. She stared out of the window, watching the city lights blur past. Elias had been stealing glances at her since they left the ballroom, but she refused to meet his gaze. She wasn't ready. Not after what Victoria had said. Elias Blackwood doesn't fall in love, he owns things. The words echoed in her mind like a poison she couldn't shake. She clenched her fists in her lap, forcing herself to breathe evenly. Elias finally spoke, his voice low. You've been quiet. Emma didn't turn, just tired. Elias didn't buy it, and he exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Did Victoria say something to you? Her heart skipped a beat. He knew. Emma hesitated for only a second before shaking her head. No. Elias's jaw clenched. He didn't believe her. The car slowed as they pulled into the Blackwood estate. As soon as the vehicle came to a stop, Emma pushed the door open and stepped out, needing distance. But Elias wasn't about to let it go. Emma? His voice was sharp, a demand. She ignored him, walking straight up the steps toward the entrance. But she barely made it inside before he caught up, grabbing her wrist and spinning her to face him. The heat in his gaze sent a shiver down her spine. Tell me what she said. Emma yanked her wrist away. Why does it matter? Elias's expression darkened. Because I know Victoria, and I know she's not the kind of woman who makes small talk. Whatever she said got under your skin. Emma let out a bitter laugh. Why? Are you worried she ruined the perfect image of our marriage? Elias's eyes flashed. That's not what this is about, and you know it. Emma lifted her chin. She said exactly what I already knew. Elias frowned. And what do you think you know? Emma's chest tightened. That this marriage is nothing more than a contract to you. His entire body stiffened. Emma took a shaky breath. Tell me, Elias, if I hadn't agreed to this deal, would you have even looked at me twice? His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. And that silence hurt more than anything he could have said. Emma let out a shaky breath. That's what I thought. She turned to walk away, but his voice stopped her cold. I wouldn't have let you walk away. Emma froze. His voice was low, raw. She turned back to face him, her heart pounding. What does that mean? Elias stepped closer, his blue eyes locking onto hers. It means that no matter what happened, I wouldn't have let you slip through my fingers. Emma swallowed hard. Because you own me. Elias flinched. His hands clenched into fists. No. Emma shook her head, forcing a laugh. You say that, but I don't know if I believe you. Elias's gaze darkened. Then let me prove it to you. Emma's breath hitched. Before she could process what was happening, he reached for her, his hands framing her face as he leaned in. And then he kissed her. The moment Elias's lips touched hers, every thought in Emma's mind disappeared. She knew she should pull away. She knew she should fight it. But the way he held her, the way his hands trembled against her skin, made it impossible. The kiss was deep, unguarded, desperate. It wasn't calculated or controlled like she expected. It was raw. Emma felt herself melting against him, her fingers gripping the fabric of his suit, as if letting go would send her spiraling. Elias pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her hair, the other pressing against the small of her back. He kissed her like he had been waiting for this moment forever, like he was afraid she would slip through his fingers if he stopped. By the time they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Emma stared at him, her heart racing. "What are we doing?" Elias's forehead rested against hers. "I don't know." Emma let out a shaky breath. This wasn't part of the deal. Elias's jaw tightened. To hell with the deal. Her eyes widened slightly. He pulled back just enough to meet her gaze. "I don't care about contracts, Emma. I don't care about obligations or business agreements. You are not a deal to me." Emma wanted to believe him. But how could she? She swallowed hard. "Then what am I?" Elias's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "Mine." Emma's heart skipped a beat. But before she could respond, the sharp sound of a phone ringing cut through the air. Elias let out a low curse, pulling his phone from his pocket. His expression darkened instantly. Emma frowned. "What is it?" Elias clenched his jaw. "My father." Emma stiffened. Elias never talked about his father. She knew they had a complicated relationship, but he rarely spoke about it. He stared at the phone for a moment before silencing the call. But Emma could see the shift in him, the way his entire body had tensed. Something was wrong. "Elias," she said softly. "What's going on?" He let out a slow breath. "I need to handle something." Emma studied him. "Is it about the company?" Elias hesitated before shaking his head. It's personal." Emma frowned. "Do you need me to do anything?" Elias glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Just stay here." Emma's stomach twisted. "That sounds an awful lot like an order." Elias sighed, dragging a hand down his face. "Emma," she crossed her arms. "Elias, if you expect me to trust you, you have to trust me too." His eyes locked onto hers. "This isn't about trust." "Then what is it?" Elias exhaled. "It's about keeping you safe." Emma's chest tightened. "Safe from what?" Elias didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'll explain everything soon," he murmured. "But for now, just trust me." Emma searched his face, trying to find any sign of what he was hiding. Finally, she nodded. Elias's shoulders relaxed slightly. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Emma standing in the quiet hallway. She had never seen Elias look so unsettled before, and that scared her more than anything. Section 9. The silence in the grand Blackwood estate felt heavier than ever. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing with everything that had happened. The kiss, Elias's unexpected confession, the phone call that changed everything. She had tried to sleep, but her body refused to rest. The sheets felt too cold without him there, and the echo of his words kept replaying in her mind. "You are not a deal to me." But could she really believe him? Emma's heart wanted to trust Elias, but her head warned her to be careful. The walls he had built over the years weren't so easily torn down, and she couldn't ignore the fear lingering in the depths of his blue eyes when his father called. She didn't know much about the Blackwood family, only that Elias never spoke of them. His past was a locked door, and tonight, that door had cracked open just enough for her to see the storm brewing behind it. Emma let out a deep sigh, running a hand through her hair. She couldn't just sit here and wait. She needed to know the truth. Without wasting another moment, she grabbed a sweater and made her way downstairs. The estate was eerily quiet, the dim glow of the chandeliers casting long shadows across the marble floors. She hesitated for a moment before stepping into Elias's office. The room smelled like him, leather, cedarwood, and the faintest hint of whiskey. Papers were scattered across his desk, and a single glass of scotch sat untouched. Her fingers traced the edge of the desk as she let her gaze wander. It was the first time she had really taken in the space where he worked. That was when she saw it. A framed photo tucked away behind a stack of documents. She reached for it carefully, her heart pounding as she turned it over. It was a picture of Elias when he was younger, maybe 18 or 19. He stood beside a tall, imposing man with the same sharp features and piercing blue eyes. Emma didn't need to be told who he was. Elias's father. Even in the photo, the man radiated cold authority. There was no warmth in his gaze, no fatherly affection, just power. Emma swallowed hard, setting the picture back down. So much suddenly made sense. Elias wasn't just trying to be different from his father. He was running from him. And now, after all these years, that past was coming back to haunt him. A sharp knock on the front door made her jump. Emma's pulse quickened. Who would be here at this hour? She hesitated before making her way toward the entrance, her bare feet barely making a sound against the marble floor. The moment she opened the door, she felt the air shift. A tall man stood before her, dressed in an immaculate suit. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his piercing blue eyes sent a chill down her spine. Emma's breath caught. She had seen those eyes before. Elias's father. "Who are you?" Emma asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. A slow, calculating smile curved on his lips. "You must be Emma." She didn't answer. The man took a step forward, his presence commanding. "My name is Victor Blackwood. I believe we have some things to discuss." Emma gripped the edge of the door, her instincts screaming at her to close it. But before she could react, a strong hand gripped her wrist. "Emma." She turned sharply to find Elias standing behind her, his expression dark with fury. Victor smirked. "Ah, just in time." Elias stepped in front of her, shielding her from his father's gaze. "What the hell are you doing here?" Victor tilted his head. "Is that any way to greet your father?" Elias's jaw clenched. "You lost the right to call yourself that a long time ago." Victor let out a soft chuckle, completely unfazed. "Still so dramatic, I see." His gaze flickered past Elias, settling on Emma once again. "And this is the woman who has captured your attention." Elias's entire body tensed. "Leave her out of this." Victor's smile didn't waver. "You always were protective of your possessions." Emma flinched at the word. Elias growled lowly. "She's not a possession, and I won't let you use her against me." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you think? That I came here to threaten your little romance?" Elias didn't respond. Victor sighed, shaking his head. "I came to give you a warning, Elias. You've been careless lately." Elias's hands clenched into fists. "Get to the point." Victor's expression turned cold. "Your enemies are watching, and they've noticed your distractions." Emma's stomach twisted. Elias let out a sharp breath. "If you're here to scare me, you're wasting your time." Victor smirked. "Oh, my dear boy, I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to remind you of what's at stake." His gaze flickered to Emma one last time before he turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the night like a ghost. The moment he was gone, Emma turned to Elias. "What the hell was that?" she demanded. Elias ran a hand down his face, looking exhausted. "That was my father, the man who ruins everything he touches." Emma crossed her arms. "And what did he mean by distractions?" Elias's jaw tightened. "He meant you." Emma felt her breath hitch. "Me?" Elias turned to face her fully, his eyes stormy with frustration. "You're the only thing in my life I can't control, Emma, and that terrifies him." Emma stared at him. "Why?" Elias hesitated before finally admitting, "Because he knows I'd burn the whole world down for you." Silence fell between them. Emma's heart pounded so hard it hurt. She had spent so long questioning how Elias truly felt, if she meant anything to him beyond their contract. And now, standing in the middle of the Blackwood estate, she finally had her answer. But with Victor Blackwood lurking in the shadows, she knew this was far from over. Elias wasn't just fighting for her. He was fighting for them. Section 10. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at Elias, his confession still echoing in her mind. He'd burn the whole world down for her. It was the most terrifying and beautiful thing she had ever heard. But she knew what it meant. Victor Blackwood wasn't just a father trying to warn his son. He was a man who controlled people like chess pieces, and now she was part of his game. Elias turned away, his body tense. "I should have known he'd come for you." Emma swallowed. "What does he want?" Elias let out a dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Control. That's all he's ever wanted. And now he thinks he can use you to get to me." Emma's fingers curled into fists. "And what are you going to do?" Elias exhaled sharply, turning to her with a look of sheer determination. "Protect you, no matter what it takes." She wanted to believe him, but the weight of everything crashed down on her. The contract, the lies, the feeling she was no longer sure she could contain. "Elias," she started hesitantly, "this isn't just about me, is it?" His jaw tightened. "You're afraid of becoming him," she whispered. Elias flinched as if she had struck him. Emma stepped closer, searching his face. You think you have to fight him alone, that if you let anyone in, you'll turn into the same cold, ruthless man. Elias stayed silent. She reached for his hand, her voice softer now. But you're not him, Elias. You never were. He let out a bitter breath. I don't know if that's true. Emma's heart clenched. She had spent so long hating the fact that their marriage had started as a business transaction, that it had never been real. But now, she saw the truth. Elias had been fighting a battle long before she entered his life. And despite everything, he was still here, with her, falling for her. A loud chime suddenly rang through the estate, making them both jump. Elias stiffened. That's the security alarm. Emma's stomach dropped. Someone's here? Elias grabbed her hand. Stay behind me. They moved swiftly through the house, tension crackling in the air. When they reached the front door, Elias pulled it open, only to be met with a familiar figure. Victor Blackwood. Emma's breath caught, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him were two men in sharp suits, their expressions void of emotion. Elias's voice was ice. I told you to stay the hell away. Victor merely smiled. And I told you I had no intentions of letting this situation continue. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Elias stepped forward, his fury barely contained. You don't control me. Victor's smirk deepened. I don't have to. But you know as well as I do, your enemies are watching. And right now, your little love affair is making you weak. Emma's heart pounded. What are you talking about? Victor's gaze flickered to her. Do you really think Elias has no enemies, my dear? That no one would use you against him? Elias growled. Enough. Victor sighed. If you refuse to handle this, I will. Elias's expression darkened. Touch her and I will end you. A slow, amused chuckle escaped Victor's lips. So dramatic, just like your mother. Emma saw the slight twitch in Elias's jaw, the only sign that the words had struck a nerve. Victor's voice lowered. But you know I'm right, and sooner or later you'll have to make a choice. Elias's hand clenched into a fist. I already have. Without another word, he grabbed Emma's hand and slammed the door in his father's face. The second they were alone, Elias turned to her, his entire body rigid with tension. He's not going to stop, he said darkly. Emma swallowed hard. What do we do? Elias took a shaky breath as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. Then his grip tightened around hers. We leave. Emma blinked. What? I'm done playing his games, Elias said firmly. If staying here puts you in danger, then we go. Emma stared at him. You're serious? Elias cupped her face, his voice rough with emotion. I don't care about the money. I don't care about the company. None of it means anything if you're not safe. Emma's breath hitched. He wasn't lying. Elias Blackwood, one of the most powerful men in the world, was willing to walk away from everything for her. She placed her hands over his. Then let's go. Elias exhaled, nodding. The decision was made. They packed only what they needed, leaving behind the mansion, the business, the empire Elias had spent his life building. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was losing. Because for the first time, he was choosing love over power. As they boarded a private plane, Emma glanced at him. Where are we going? Elias took her hand, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. Somewhere no one can find us. She smiled, because wherever he was, she knew that was where she belonged. And this time it wasn't about contracts, it was about forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. What would you do in Emma's situation? Stay or run? Let us know in the comments below. The comments below. The comments below.